All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for showing up this morning to officially welcome back Kelly Krauskopf as President of Basketball Business Operations for.
Nobody saw it coming. Not the fans, not the media, not even the people inside that building who were supposed to see everything coming. And when the president of the Indiana Fever finally said the quiet part out loud, 5 words into a sentence that most people scrolled past, it didn't just start a controversy. It cracked something open. Something that had been quietly building for 2 years underneath the lights behind the locker room doors, and inside a franchise that had no idea it was sitting on the most explosive opportunity in the history of women's sports. But here's what nobody is talking about. The real story isn't about Caitlin Clark at all. It's about what happens when an organization doesn't understand what it actually has and what it costs everyone when they figure it out too late. Let's start with the part that everyone forgot, because before Caitlin Clark ever set foot in Indiana, the Fever were barely a franchise in any meaningful sense of the word. 6 wins in 2021, 5 wins in 2022, 13 in 2023. You read that right. 13 wins. In a league where playoff spots aren't exactly impossible to come by, the Indiana Fever had spent nearly a decade becoming invisible. No cameras, no sellouts, no storylines. Players came and went. Coaches came and went. The spotlight moved on without them every single year. And then, one morning in April 2024, everything changed in a way that nobody inside that front office had the framework to fully process. Because the number 1 overall pick walked through the door, and within weeks, the entire sport of women's basketball had been restructured around her existence. Sellout crowds everywhere the Fever played. Television ratings that had never been touched in the history of the league. Jerseys selling faster than they could print them. A media cycle so intense that reporters who had never covered a WNBA game in their lives were suddenly filing daily dispatches from Indianapolis. And that's the moment the Fever faced a choice that would define everything that came after. Do you build around the wave, or do you try to manage it? Do you understand that what just walked into your franchise is once in a generation, or do you treat it like a business problem to be optimized? They made a decision. And it seemed smart on paper. They brought in Kelly Krauskopf, a woman with serious credentials, a championship pedigree, and genuine roots inside the Indiana Fever organization going back years. This wasn't a desperate hire. This looked like the right move. And when she stepped in front of the cameras for her introductory press conference, she said all the things you'd expect: commitment, culture, growth, sustained success. But there was one specific moment, one particular sentence buried inside that press conference that nobody flagged at the time. And that silence, that collective decision to move past it without asking a follow-up question, is exactly how the storm got built. Because the storm was always coming. It was just waiting for the right moment to arrive. Fast forward to July 2025, and everything inside the Fever world is under pressure. Caitlin Clark has played in only 11 games this season after a groin injury derailed what should have been her full breakout campaign as the face of a rising franchise. The fans are frustrated. The team is hovering right at the edge of postseason relevance. The energy around Indiana basketball, which had been electric just months before, now has this brittle, anxious quality, like something is about to snap. And then, on the same day that all of that tension is peaking, something gets unearthed. Not new. Not from yesterday. From October 2024. The footage from that introductory press conference somehow resurfaces on social media, and this time, people actually listen. Really listen. This is about the Indiana Fever, Krauskopf says, looking straight into the cameras. Yes, Aaliyah Boston and Caitlin Clark are our core players, and we intend to continue developing them. But I want our team to become a national leader and an enduring brand like Apple. 5 words. That was all it took. And the reaction wasn't confusion. It wasn't mild skepticism. It was a wildfire. Because those 5 words, delivered in that specific order, did something that no press release or controversy could have manufactured. They made people feel like they suddenly understood something that had been hidden from them. The Apple comparison didn't land as inspiration. It landed as a reveal. Because everyone knows what Apple's story actually is. Everyone knows that Apple's greatest tragedy, the chapter that nearly destroyed the entire company, was the moment they convinced themselves they were bigger than the visionary at the center of everything. They pushed Steve Jobs out. The company collapsed. They brought him back. And suddenly, here was the president of the Indiana Fever using that exact analogy, and the internet decided in real time that she had accidentally told the truth about how the front office actually saw Caitlin Clark. Not as the foundation, not as the irreplaceable center of everything they were building, but as a component, a feature, one piece of a larger brand architecture. The clip spread so fast it was almost impossible to track. Fan accounts were overlaying graphics. Sports commentators were doing live reaction videos. The comment sections turned into something that felt less like sports discourse and more like a genuine reckoning. One fan wrote that enduring brands are built around stars, that Apple proved a company is nothing without its visionary, and asked what exactly the Fever thought they were doing. Another one went further, said that when Clark finally decides she's done watching the front office operate like this, the organization will have to live with having squandered the best opportunity in the history of women's sports. And then something happened that made everyone pay even closer attention. Kroskoff's social media, all of it went dark. Not a statement. Not a clarification. Not a single word. Just silence, and an empty profile where there had been an active presence just days before. Someone inside that building made a calculated decision to disappear rather than respond, and that choice, more than the clip itself, told the story that the clip only started. But while the front office drama was consuming social media, something else was happening, something that complicated the whole narrative in ways that the loudest voices online weren't prepared to engage with. Because the players, the actual human beings lacing up their shoes every night inside that locker room, were telling a story that sounded almost nothing like what the critics had spent months assuming. Lexie Hull, one of Caitlin Clark's closest people inside the franchise, sat down with Glamour magazine and said something that nobody in the Fever organization had been willing to say publicly before. She confirmed what had been whispered about for 2 seasons, that teams around the league weren't just competing against the Fever. They were specifically, deliberately targeting them because of one player. Hull said it plainly that there was jealousy about the Fever because of the media attention, and that teams were openly saying in their own locker rooms that they could not let Indiana win. Just let that sit for a second. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. This was a teammate saying, clearly and calmly, that the competitive landscape of the entire league had been quietly reorganized around stopping one person. And if that wasn't enough, Sophie Cunningham stepped in and made it even more concrete. Cunningham, the player who had already established herself as Clark's de facto enforcer, the one who made it known from her very first games in a Fever uniform that taking cheap shots at her teammate would have consequences, confirmed that the conversations about Clark had been happening in opposing locker rooms before she even got to Indiana. When she was still in Phoenix, she heard it. Explicit discussions. Not about beating the Fever. About sending a message to Clark specifically. About making her understand that the WNBA was not Iowa and that the welcome was going to be physical. And the thing is, when you go back through the 2024 and 2025 seasons with that information in mind, the footage reads completely differently. The hard fouls, the late hits, the moments where referees looked the other way while Clark was getting knocked around in ways that genuinely surprised people who watch basketball at a high level. By the time her groin injury forced her out of the lineup after just 13 games of the 2025 season, the argument that the officiating had adequately protected her had almost entirely collapsed among people paying close attention. The answer was no. And it wasn't close. But here is where the story takes the turn that everyone missed, because while all of this external chaos was building, the internal chemistry of the Fever told a story that directly contradicted everything the critics had been predicting. The locker room was supposed to be fractured. That was the narrative that had been pushed hardest, most aggressively, and most persistently since Clark arrived. Hall of Famer Cheryl Swoops said it on a podcast in September 2024 that key Fever players were quietly showing signs that the Clark situation was too much, that the dynamics around her were creating fractures that couldn't be fixed. It spread fast. It became the background assumption for a significant portion of the discourse. And then Clark appeared as a guest on a March Madness show hosted by Diana Taurasi and Brianna Stewart, and instead of getting defensive, instead of being visibly frustrated, she said something that was almost unsettlingly calm. She said you get used to people thinking they know what happens behind closed doors when they simply don't. No anger. No performance. Just someone who had clearly decided that the noise was no longer worth the energy it would take to fight it. And then the 2025 playoffs arrived, and the locker room showed everyone exactly who it actually was. Clark's teammates stormed the court after the final buzzer. They cut off her post-game interview just to pile on top of her. The energy in that room after winning the Commissioner's Cup wasn't polished or camera-ready. It was genuinely, messily, unmistakably real. These were people who actually liked each other. Aaliyah Boston and Clark had built something that went beyond basketball. Lexie Hull had become one of Clark's closest confidants in a city neither of them grew up in. The newer additions Sophie Cunningham included were expressing admiration before they had even played a game together, which is not how it goes when a locker room is actually broken. Michaela Timpson, the rookie who made the final roster, showed Clark a kind of genuine respect that cannot be coached or faked for cameras. And then Clark did something small that actually said everything. After the expansion draft took 2 of her teammates away, she posted on Instagram not a PR-approved statement, just a personal message. Cub, I love you, for Christy Wallace. My Aussie for life, for Chloe Bibiway. Real grief over real relationships. The kind of thing you post when it actually hurts, not when your publicist tells you it would look good. So the locker room wasn't the problem. The teammates weren't the problem. The jealousy was real, but it was coming from outside the building, not inside it. And that distinction changes the entire story because it means the actual tension at the heart of the Indiana Fever wasn't about whether Caitlin Clark could coexist with her teammates. It was about whether the people at the top of the organization had the clarity, the commitment, and the courage to build everything, every decision, every acquisition, every strategic priority around what they actually had. And that is the question that 5 words reopened. Because when Krauskopf made the Apple comparison, and then went silent when the world pushed back, she didn't just create a bad news cycle. She created a legitimacy crisis inside an organization that was already walking a tightrope. And what makes this genuinely complicated, what makes it more than just a villain and hero story, is that Krauskopf wasn't wrong about needing sustainability. Winning in sports is never just about one player. Franchises that build their entire identity around a single person and fail to develop depth, culture, and infrastructure around them don't sustain success. She knew that. She said it openly. Caitlin Clark was 10 years old when Indiana won its only title in 2012, Krauskopf noted. She talked about how sometimes it takes a generation to reach the next level. The long game is real. The philosophy isn't wrong. But the delivery, the framing, and the timing made it feel like something else entirely, like the organization was comfortable with Clark being a part of the story rather than the reason the story exists at all. And that gap between what was meant and what was heard is where trust goes to die inside a sports franchise. Because fans don't follow mission statements. They follow what they believe is true about where a team's heart actually lives. And when the president of the organization goes silent, instead of showing up to explain herself, the silence becomes the answer. So, where does this leave everything? Here's the thing about the Indiana Fever right now that almost nobody has said clearly. They are not a failed experiment. They are not a cautionary tale, not yet. They are an organization that got handed a miracle and is still in the middle of deciding whether it has the institutional courage to honor it fully. Caitlin Clark has not asked out. She has not complained publicly. She has not thrown anyone under any bus. She has shown up, gotten knocked around, dealt with injury, watched the discourse spiral around her, and continued to operate with a level-headedness that is genuinely remarkable for someone her age.